Have you ever had concerns that the electromagnetic fields that all of us in modern society are constantly being exposed to could be damaging your health? It's a difficult subject to tackle, actually, because there's a ton of conflicting information out there. See, on the one hand, you have a group of experts saying that the invisible energy fields that come out of things like cell phones and other electronic devices are perfectly safe and there's nothing to worry about. But on the other hand, there's a group of experts beating the drum as loud as they possibly can, warning that EMFs pose a very serious threat to human health, and at the very least, we need a lot more research so that proper guidelines can be established to avoid any unwanted effects. But it's difficult to know where to turn. So this week, I got to sit down with the EMF guy, Nicolas Pineault, to get clarity on the subject. We talk all about the different kinds of EMFs, where they come from, and what the peer-reviewed literature has to say about their effects on the human body. Let's get into this. Nicolas Pineault, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, you are the non-tinfoil EMF guy.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm really excited to talk to you. So why don't you tell me where that line came from?
Yeah, well, I have just a background as a citizen journalist, so I have a bachelor's degree in communications, and I come at this problem of EMFs from a background of environmental toxins. I studied environmental toxins just out of my personal interest, and then eventually I developed a newsletter talking about my, let's say, amateur research on glyphosate and filtering water. Why is that important? And I realized that there are many low-level toxins that we are chronically exposed to over time at very low levels, so we don't necessarily feel it with one glass of water, but over time they do have a biological effect. And it got me a little bit I would say angry with authorities almost, because there's not a lot of talk about prevention, about optimizing health. It's a lot about treating disease and not a lot about preventing disease in the first place. And I think that lowering our exposure to these environmental toxins, including plastics, including different things that we know are endocrine disruptors, is so key. And when I stumbled upon the topic of EMFs, that's electromagnetic fields or frequencies or radiation that's emitted by cell phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and also, high voltage power lines, so many things in our modern world, I discovered that the topic is not only serious, it's extremely urgent to start to reduce exposure. But what I found is this also: while a lot of people could concede that, yeah, environmental toxins, they do exist, and some skeptics would argue, oh, but the danger is overblown. Most of them say that because they haven't looked at the dangers in the research at all, and are not familiar. And I guess they kind of put that in a fringe corner of the internet. It was even worse, that phenomenon of thinking that the entire topic of EMFs is fringe. It's tinfoil hatter stuff. Well, that kind of refers to wearing an aluminum paper hat, right? Because you're crazy. So if you think that EMFs are a danger, if you think that cell phones are dangerous, you're a crazy person. That's kind of the meme on the internet. And I wanted to address that right away in the title of my book, to kind of lure people in and say, look, guys, this is the non-tinfoil version of this. There's actual research on this. And when you dive into the topic of EMFs and you realize, my God, it's not one random scientist that's been sounding the alarm and doing serious research for the last decades. It's hundreds of independent scientists that have been trying to sound the alarm. And you have a lot of other scientists that say there's no problem, but usually they come from a background in physics and not biophysics, which pertains to the biological effects of these fields. So they don't necessarily understand how these things work. And a lot of them also have ties with the industry. So there's, once again, a sort of phenomenon where you have money incentives kind of blurring or confusing the science and trying to stall the advancement of science, because it would be extremely inconvenient to say to the public, your cell phone is dangerous. That's not something that regulators would like to say. That's not something the industry would like to say. And in the end, I think this is what needs to be said is at least your everyday gadgets are not safe and they do have effects on your health.
It's very interesting that you come at it from the environmental pollutant angle, and that you took this approach of the non-tinfoil, which is like, hey, let's blow out all the superstition and just look at the research. So I have some personal experience with this, Nicholas. My parents purchased a house in the early 1980s, brand new house, new construction. And they ended up pulling out at the last minute from that house because it was too close to the power lines. And the reason that the time frame is significant for this is because in reading some of the research in preparation for my conversation with you, I read that in 1979, there was a study that showed a direct relationship between EMFs, the type of which are emitted from those very large, powerful power lines, and increased incidence of leukemia in infants and little kids. And so this was, I don't want to say common knowledge, but it was in the public awareness enough in the late 70s and early 80s that it caused my parents to pull out of a house to not risk raising their children close to the power lines. And then I came to read in literature reviews that studies have consistently shown increased risk specifically for childhood leukemia associated with the type of extremely low frequency magnetic fields that come out of those power lines. Can you talk a little bit about that and the number of studies that have corroborated that?
100%. Well, I don't know the exact number of studies, but when they convened the meeting at the WHO, a branch of the WHO called the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, in 2001 and 2002, they came to the conclusion that these power lines, what they emit, this extremely low frequency or ELF frequencies, that cause literally you, if you live underneath a power line or very close to it, you are living in a constant exposure to this magnetic component of the field, which could have biological effect. And it looks like the children are most at risk because of this strong correlation they found. So they declared it a class 2B possible carcinogen. It is the lowest classification possible. It caused massive controversy. It caused controversy from the 70s up to the beginning of the 2000s. But then after that, most of the research moved to wireless because, of course, 2002, you had a few cell phone towers here and there. Mostly, business people were using cell phones, the military, and a few people, but not the entire society. Whereas nowadays, 2024, you'd be hard pressed to find someone without a cell phone in most of the Western world, and this will be true of the entire planet within a few years' time. That's the prediction. We're going to have billions more users of cell phones within the next decade.
Mhm.
So the reality is most of the research at this point did not get funded to kind of confirm or deny that risk, but there are interesting studies on the risk of miscarriages going way up when you live in these fields as well. And I guess that's a population that's even more, the population being, unborn fetuses is even more at risk compared to a child that is already born, just because there's rapid cell growth, there's brain development, and these mechanism seems to be very delicate, and they use electricity at all levels of biology, of course. And what researchers think is that there is a type of calcium channels called the L-type voltage gated calcium channels. So there's a specific channels that shuttles calcium in and out of the cell that might be one of the most affected by these types of fields. And that's true for the extremely low frequency, but also for the wireless. What's interesting is that after that, the main dangers that were identified, and let's say what was in the public sphere was these dangers around talking on a phone and developing a brain tumor. So I think this is really where the conversation shifted in the early 2000s, and even a little bit before that in the 90s, when you had the controversy with one man live on Larry King at the time, very, very popular late night show at the time in the US, that was claiming that his tumor was caused by a phone. And it caused the PR nightmare for cell phone companies. They said, okay, we're going to pour money in research. We have to prove that these risks do not exist.
Mhm.
They hired certain scientists like Dr. George Carlo, and the story isn't clear of exactly what happened, but in the end, Carlo said, I cannot publish these results, and he claims that he found results that were inconvenient to the industry, and he had to pull out of his research. There's other things that happened, but it led also to a decision by the IARC, the same branch that declared these extremely low frequency as a class 2B carcinogen, also declared the radio frequency, which is the wireless emissions from laptops to Wi-Fi to Bluetooth. They're also now a class 2B carcinogen since 2011.
Mhm.
But here's where my work comes in, because when I started looking at this, it was 2016 when I started diving into it. I wrote my book in 2017. So all of these decisions were already past us, but the science had already evolved after that 2011 decision. In 2018, scientists that are among them top epidemiologists in the topic of cell tumors, like Dr. Anthony Miller, for example, declared that if we reconvene a meeting at IARC, at the International Agency for Research on Cancer, given the new studies that we have, large, among them 2 large rat and mice studies showing clear signs of carcinogenicity in these animals when they're exposed to radio frequency, if we add those new studies in, it should be a class 1 carcinogen. This is what they said. That was 2018. And it shocked me. Right after writing my book, I said, my God, maybe I even underestimated the risks in the book, because a class 1 carcinogen is a definite carcinogen. It makes it in the same category as asbestos or tobacco smoke. And we know that these agents are dangerous. Still, people smoke to this day. Still, asbestos is used more than probably it should, especially in the US still, but it's being rolled out because we know it's a problem. We know that for each time we use these agents, or we permit these agents to be there, especially asbestos, like in certain products or construction materials, we're going to increase the risks that people will have cancer later in life. So there's a cost to society. There's, massive trauma for people that have cancer, die from cancer. So we have to protect people. So we have to at least inform them about these risks. But so far, it has not happened. And in fact, this meeting at IARC was supposed to happen, and now it looks like it's stalling. So a lot of scientists are saying there's industry pressure not to relook at the data. There's a lot of politics involved. And in the meantime, the message that I talk about these days is exactly the same as back in 2017, given that we had early indications that the EMFs that we are exposed on an everyday basis might be a stressor, might be a danger to your health long term. We owe it to ourselves to start reducing exposure. That's a simple message, is
Sure.
that when you have scientific uncertainty, it's not the time to laugh at the topic and say and completely disregard it. To the contrary, if you get it wrong, there's massive possibility of doing harm in the future. Let's say if you get it wrong now, you laugh about it, you'd say, okay, you know what, it's just a class 2B carcinogen, it's not even serious. A lot of people say that these days. Well, maybe in 30 years is going to be a class 1 carcinogen, and everyone that starts reducing exposure now, and everyone that is more prudent towards these exposures, will have done great to their body. And maybe, and I don't wish that on anyone, but maybe some people will be sorry for themselves, because if it's linked with brain tumors, that's something that a lot of people have fatal issues with, or that leave scars permanently in the case of certain brain tumors that they can survive. So it's very serious, and that's just for the brain tumor component.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as very odd that somebody would say it's just a class 2 carcinogen, so I'm going to act flippantly towards it. Once it's a class 1, then I'll take it seriously. Like if the
Yeah.
message is, hey, let's reduce our exposure in the face of scientific uncertainty and the potential that this is a problem, that seems very prudent to me. But let's take a step back, because I'm not an expert in in EMFs, excuse me, and I suspect that most of the people watching this are not experts in it as well. So I want to give you my understanding of EMFs and their effects on the body,
Sure.
and I'd like for you to fill in the gaps. So the idea here is that the body has certain electrical impulses that are going on at a regular rate for cell-to-cell communication, for example, in the body, or depolarization of the heart cells. And this is our activation of muscles, or whatever it is. But all of these are tightly regulated, and they're all important for achieving a specific function. The idea is that when these external EMFs are now acting on the body, there is the potential to interrupt some of these electrical signals that are happening, and thus alter physiology in a way that we don't understand. And frankly, based on the research that I've done, in a way that varies significantly depending on the type of EMF or the frequency of that EMF, which makes sense, right? Like there are different, if we want to beat the heart at a different rhythm, that those nodes inside of the heart are going to be firing at a different frequency. So it makes sense that a different frequency input would exert a different effect in the body. So fill in the gaps there and let me know how that leads to something like childhood leukemia or brain tumors. The other part that I would like for you to distinguish for me is, in reading, there's EMFs that are taking place at a certain frequency that cause a thermal effect, where it's actually heating up tissues inside of your body. But, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but most of the exposure that we're getting nowadays is of the non-thermal variety. So it's affecting our tissues, but there's not necessarily any overt signs in the short term that that's taking place.
Exactly. Well, your understanding is very, very good on this, and that's a great way to put it. That's not the way I would have put it years ago, but my understanding now is simply this is electromagnetic biointerference. It's interfering with our normal biology, which is partially EMF based. There's light communication inside the body. There's up to millimeter wave communication between cells. I read some of this. On red blood cells, white blood cells, cell differentiation. There's research on stem cells. How can they find where the injury is? Part of it is an electrical signal that increases when you have a wound. There's all sorts of research on also bone fractures. How can the bone connect with each other? Part of it is an increase in electrical charge, and if it's missing there, sometimes the bone will not heal. And that's part of the PEMF research, pulse electromagnetic field therapy. And I talked with Dr. Pollock a few years ago, and it was very fascinating because when you apply a magnetic field to that wound, it can increase the electrical charge of these cells. And in many situations, it will make those non-union fractures that are older than 6 months, and sometimes even older than that, and will not heal. You have a magnetic field, and somehow now they will heal. So there's something there. You can have positive effects at the cell level, and you can have negative effects, but it depends on what is applied. And really, the problem is that the research around therapeutics, how we can use EMFs to our benefit, to, for example, cause an adaptation in the cell where it increases the production of ATP, like the mitochondria will be more efficient, or other things, lowering inflammation, bone healing, tissue regeneration, collagen production. There's a lot of good research on therapeutics and even light therapies, but that research is not those researchers are not talking to the engineers that are creating machines that use EMFs, but just to communicate. And the fact that we have signals on these EMF waves and signals that are quite erratic, and also signal characteristics that are quite erratic, a PEMF would have a relatively smooth wave and will have a certain pulsation rate where they try to optimize it for healing. Your cell phone has a pulsation rate that is completely erratic, completely chaotic, and almost random, in the sense that engineers have chosen these modulation patterns and pulsation rates and signal characteristics not to optimize for health, but to optimize for data transfer. And that's really the problem we have, is a disregard on what it does to the body. Part of it, to go back to your second part of your question, part of it is because of this thermal hypothesis that has really been disproven thousands of times at this point, which is, if we don't have an overheating of the tissues, there's no issue. There's no biological effects that are worth mentioning. And that's, let's say, a very simplistic way of putting the position of industry and also a lot of regulators at the moment. But the early research on, when you look at why is that? Why do scientists think that, or certain scientists think that only thermal effects matter? Well, it's based on research by just a few rats and a few monkeys, where they increased the thermal effect of EMFs in a cage, and they saw these animals stop eating, behavioral changes after a while. And then they put a safety factor that was completely almost made up, almost conjured out of thin air, is how certain scientists have described it recently, trying to shake things up and say, look, this is research from the 80s. It was very poorly done. And somehow this is cited as, what is the scientific reality? When you look at studies that ask the question, are there effects below this thermal threshold? In other words, when the level is low enough, you don't feel the heat. You're not overheating tissue. You're barely heating anything. But do you have effects? Well, the vast majority of studies on oxidative stress, for example, at non-thermal levels, showed that there are effects. So it's very, very bizarre. Like, there's just in February of last year, Dr. Henry Lai, who's one of the early researchers in EMFs, has a directory of 290 studies around EMFs and free radical related cellular processes. And he shows that 91% of studies published since 97 do show biological effects. And that's at non-thermal levels, 91% of studies. So in fact, when people say, oh, this is not serious, and they haven't looked at these studies, because the vast majority of studies confirm that there are biological effects at non-thermal levels. But the argument then, and I think that the industry will recuperate this, and skeptics will say, well, what is the effect, right? To what extent is that a problem? Is that a little bit of oxidative stress where the body is completely capable of, of recuperating, and we shouldn't even mention it? Well, that's where we look at not only what happens at the cell level, but at the population level. For example, the link between a disruption in sperm and having a phone in your pocket as a man is quite convincing. In fact, it's so convincing that now you have researchers from the Cleveland Clinic that have been pioneers in this field in the last 20 years that are telling fertility patients that have a hard time conceiving to avoid keeping a phone in the pocket. But they've been telling that for over a decade at this point in certain fertility clinics, which is bizarre because, again, if you believe what the industry said and even the regulators, it shouldn't happen, because it's proven that not only is there a thermal effect when it comes to sperm, but also the non-thermal effects on oxidative damage to sperm, which causes changes in motility and all aspects of sperm quality and count. So right there is a big problem. We're not talking about cancer, but how is important having normal fertility and probably closely linked to a normal hormonal function in men? Well, that's key. That's super important. But again, if you believe that cell phones are completely safe, you will not take these precautions. And what we end up with is a population where the majority of men have a phone in their pocket. and are not aware of this link at all because it's not on the insert. It's not in the packaging yet, and the industry is fighting everything they can to avoid having these effects written black on white.
It's so interesting that this there's this background in all of this, that there was research that originally came out that showed that these EMFs were dangerous. The communications industry then goes out of their way to fund a study proving that their products are safe. The researchers do the research and say, look, you guys are not going to like what I'm going to publish. So they torpedo the whole project. And now, but this is still going on like 20 years later. And there's arguments here that are just absolutely foolish, in my opinion. Like, why are we going to argue the merits of a type 2 carcinogen versus a type 1 carcinogen and whether or not we need to be cautious about that? Why are we going to argue the merits of the thermic effect versus a non-thermic effect when we know that too much X-ray radiation, which we also cannot see, is extremely damaging? I mean, the man who created X-ray killed his wife by testing out his invention on her. He irradiated her to death. And it's just bizarre to me. Like, if there's a question mark about the safety, it behooves all of us to take simple steps like not keeping a cell phone in our pockets, which is not a big ask. You know, it's if that question mark is there, it seems like a good idea to take simple precautions wherever possible.
For sure. And just a quick example of effects that are not as dramatic, or let's say that do not seem as dangerous as cancer or fertility loss, just sleep quality reduction is a big one. But look at this. It's about 20 years ago that the early studies on can cell phones impact brain waves before sleep, and which would impact the sleep patterns, right? Our brains emit waves. And again, we're talking about electromagnetic interference from a phone. The phone emits a wave, the brain emits a wave, and somehow there's, those waves cross and it causes a problem in the brain. So if it does cause a problem, how much of a problem is that? So researchers in a sleep clinic in the UK looked at that. It was, if I recall correctly, it might have been 2008, and an article in Scientific American that was very, that made me very angry, was posted on the topic. And you'll understand why, is that those same researchers who did find effect and said, my God, when we have a 30-minute exposure to a cell phone right next to these men's head, they have a sleep onset of 1 hour additionally. So they have basically 1 hour of tossing and turning in the bed, and they cannot fall asleep, as if their system needs to find its way. The brainwaves need to replace and to recuperate and to, figure out what is happening with this cell phone signal, and then they can go to sleep. So for anyone, it would mean, less of a good health for sure. It would mean a long-term effects on your ability to have normal hormones, blood sugar regulation, energy levels, and just life enjoyment overall. It's a huge deal. But the researchers said this: we cannot conclude that EMFs are dangerous or that your cell phone is dangerous because the arousal effect of these waves to the brain is just the equivalent of half a cup of coffee.
Wow.
And that's not a joke. So that's the kind of hubris that these people might have, where they say, it's not very dangerous, just half a cup of coffee. But guys, we have a population that does not sleep enough in number of hours, does not have the best quality. We know that. We know that this is a public health crisis. So if you add the phone, and it's not just 30 minutes of exposure that most people have, a lot of people sleep with their phone under the pillow. What is it causing? We don't know to this day, because there hasn't been a lot of updated research. And to this day, I have sleep scientists that tell me I'm very skeptical that cell phones can impact sleep, and they haven't read the research. So the reality is, if your phone impacts your sleep 5%, it has an effect on your health. And maybe it's not, a huge danger, But to me, it is a dangerous thing to have things around you that you're not even aware might impact your health in the long term and short term as well. I mean, why do I feel like this? I wake up in the morning, I'm not rested. For sure, it's alcohol, it's stress, it's this and that, it's toxins, but also the cell phone. And what makes me angry is that that cell phone part, a lot of people miss it. A lot of people don't know about it. And even a lot of people would say, this is not serious research. No one is doing research on this. Like these dangers are just conjured out of thin air by those tinfoil hatters, but they're not.
Well, let's take a step back because a lot of this has focused on cell phones, but my original exposure was through those the power lines that are the extremely low frequency. And let's talk about the different types of EMFs, because on some level we could talk about it as a summation effect where you're not just being affected by the cell phones, but you're also getting EMFs from other sources. So let's talk about the different types of EMFs and then all of the common sources that people are getting exposed to. Like, for example, the monitor of my computer that I'm looking at you through right now is giving me some exposure of EMFs. Now, all of these are different frequencies, which mean they all have a potential to impact the body in different ways. So can you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. Well, I would say there's different classifications of EMFs depending on, are you talking about electrical engineers? What I talk about generally is those building biologists, because they have there's an entire profession focused on mitigating EMFs and also other environmental toxins in the goal of having a home place or workplace that is that is conclusive to good health. So it's really a focus on prevention, on health optimization, and long-term thinking. And that's really exactly my philosophy. So in building biology, they look at different types of EMFs, including what you mentioned, the power lines, which is in the ELF range, extremely low frequency. And there's a magnetic component of this that acts like a bubble around an object, such as the power lines, quite a large bubble, or even just around an alarm clock, for example. So when something is powered on and turned on and actively, like a large motor is a good example, like an air filter in your room, for example, would have quite a large magnetic field to it. And that's the magnetic component. There's also the electric component of that field, which is present even if the thing is not turned on. And that's a little bit hard to understand for some people. But if you plug something into the wall, the electric field goes in the machine and will irradiate from the machine, because most electronics or electric devices are not grounded and they have just two prongs and not three. And it means that there's going to be an electrical field around it. What it does is essentially you are exposed to a low level of electricity that is below the level of perception, or else everyone would freak out and say, my God, I'm getting electric shock. That's not it. That's a few volts of power that is considered perfectly safe. But in building biology, they find a correlation between these exposures and a loss of sleep quality in some people more than others, because they seem to be more affected, or let's say more sensitive, although some people don't like that word. But some people are, let's say, at-risk populations, and their sleep is not good if they are close to electricity. You have the wireless, which is in a completely different category of exposure. We're talking in the billions of hertz instead of 50 to 60 hertz. So that's the difference. Although on a biological standpoint, some researchers seem to think that the effects are similar, because in the end, it's just man-made electricity with certain signal characteristics that are disruptive. And whether it's low frequency or high frequency doesn't seem to make a big difference. But the wireless, a lot of people in their room, especially the bedroom where it's the most important to mitigate or to lower exposures, the alarm clock might be Bluetooth. You might have two phones or sometimes three or four phones. Some people have it for work, for personal things, a laptop, tablets. You have, of course, the everything that is Bluetooth, such as thermostats in the rooms. Some people have, everything smart. Smart is another buzzword for wireless these days. So my recommendation is to not engage with these technologies too much, because if you're trying to lower exposure, you have to go against the grain a little bit these days because, you know, the headphones are becoming all Bluetooth. All the sensors in people's home, if they have something quite modern, is all smart and wireless. So that's trying to reduce these exposures is intelligent. And then you have also a subset of electric fields that's called dirty electricity, and that's basically what different frequencies ride on your electrical grid. And that's a whole another discussion. A last one is artificial light, and it's not always included in building biology, but I find that the discussion around light is even more accessible to a lot of people because we see it, and people can feel their eyes burning if they look at a phone at a maximum brightness at night. So a lot of people realize, no, before bed I will minimize it. And even some people will use those blue blocking glasses before bed, which I think is a very good practice, or even change the light bulbs to not have something that is too bright, too white, which contains, in fact, a lot of blue spectrum, although we perceive it as a bright white light. And it's quite problematic because it will prevent your body from calming down and having proper sleep. A lot of people see a difference if they start dimming the lights and going towards more amber or red lights in the evening rather than bright white lights. And I mean, most people have realized this for themselves, but very few people practice this. So it's really reducing these exposures. And I've mentioned the bedroom. Where you reduce exposure should be where you spend a lot of time. And a lot of people ask me, you know, should I worry about my toaster? Should I worry about my Vitamix? Well, not that much because, you know, you're not spending a lot of time in front of these devices. So even if your toaster has wireless, I wouldn't focus on that. Think about your computer. Think about your favorite place on the sofa where you have a tablet. Think about when you are lying in bed for 8 hours per day, as you should, right? That these exposures are cumulative, and this is really where you should focus, is where you actually spend time. Your workplace, your car, your bed, and it really depends on your lifestyle. Like for me, I work at home, so my home office in that case is a priority for me. For other people that work in an office space, maybe their office space would be a priority. So it really has to be customized to the person instead of kind of giving the blanket advice of Vitamix is super high EMF. I've measured it and it's super dangerous. That's the kind of internet. It's not tinfoil, but sometimes it causes confusion and fear mongering because people say, oh my God, Vitamix is completely irresponsible. Look, high magnetic fields. I wouldn't worry about it too much because you're not spending a lot of time in front of the thing and it's super loud. So most people go away anyway in another room, right? Because it's kind of overwhelming.
Yeah.
So I think that the advice should really be to focus on where it makes a difference, which is the devices that are either touching your body, which correlate with the highest risk of like long-term cancer development or cell phone in the pocket, or where you have a lot of time on these machines or close to these machines.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. Like, how much time during the day are you running a Vitamix? You know?
Yeah, 30 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, why don't we worry about the steak and we can leave the peas for later. So it makes good sense to me.
Yeah.
Um, you touched there on a lot of really good stuff and a lot of stuff that I would like to go deeper into because it's really the practical side of this conversation. So to me, as an outsider looking in, there's two elements of the conversation. The first one is there enough information about EMFs to cause concern? Leave it at that. If we can agree that some of the research that has come out, like since the 1970s on childhood leukemia, and then more recently with this, I read quite a bit of research on 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi and the effects.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of studies from 2015. One of them said it's a major risk factor for brain tumors and other neurodegenerative diseases. If that doesn't warrant some concern, there was another one that said that test animals experienced heart arrhythmia and increased blood pressure, which again makes perfect sense based on that example that I gave earlier about the electrical function of the heart. And if you start interfering with that, potential outcomes. Now, this was a small animal, and I assume that they had this field pressed right up next to them. But still, it's now you're talking about, well, are you getting it at a high level or are you getting it at a low level? And is it better to have it or better to not have it? So if I frame it, like from that outsider's perspective, which is the 10,000-foot overview, does it warrant concern? Multiple studies talking about what you've touched on in this conversation, which is decreased sperm function, decreased sperm quality, decreased sperm motility, decreased activity of the cells that produce sperm in the body. The conclusion from a different 2015 study was that there should be a major concern regarding the exposure to Wi-Fi networks existing in the vicinity of our living places. This was specifically talking to people who had fertility concerns, which, let's face it, if you're looking at livestock, not humans, that animal's ability to reproduce is a major determinant of the health of that animal.
Yeah.
When an animal loses its ability to reproduce, it's very difficult to classify that animal as healthy. It wouldn't be hard to make the same argument for human beings.
I agree.
So we can kind of leave it at that. With women, I saw a study that showed that there was a positive correlation between occupational monitors, meaning women who work in front of a computer, and the ratio of fetal abnormalities and spontaneous abortions, which again is stuff that you touched on in this. But I think, we get so focused on cell phones, we forget about all of these other exposures and just the fact that these things are battering our bodies. But you started talking about prevention. So the one part of the conversation is there sufficient evidence that we should be concerned about these things? If we can agree that the answer to that is yes, part two of the question is, what are some simple things that don't really affect me at all that I can be doing to reduce my exposure? So I noticed that I'm chatting with you, and unlike many of the people that I chat to, your earbuds appear to have wires on them.
Yeah, well, wired solution, you do have a little bit of electricity, but it's not a big exposure compared to wireless. That I'm very, very concerned because, the wireless earbuds have just become popularized a few years ago. And nowadays, even, the young people are starting to pick it up as, the by default option. Even I tried to find these Bose headphones. I had to purchase them on eBay, like directly from China. It's not a joke. Because they're discontinued, Bose as a company has decided to go just Bluetooth for all their models that I could find. So it's becoming even hard not to have EMFs in your ear these days, which is crazy to me because, again, we have the cell phone dangers that have been established, and we can argue, is it a class 2B, 2A, 1 carcinogen? But now we're taking something that is, yes, a lower level of exposure, sometimes true, most of the time true. Still, you put it deeper in the ear, and we know that proximity to the brain is a big problem. So you end up with neuroscientists like Dr. Andrew Huberman at the beginning of 2023 that said, well, I looked at the research and, I'm very concerned about what it does to my auditory nerve and to the very delicate structures of the ear. But wait a minute, at the same time, you have more and more of these headphones that are wireless that are sold, and also the different hearing aids that are Bluetooth as well, without many studies that are, talking about these dangers. So I'm personally very concerned. We should minimize exposure of something that is touching the body. So I'm not a fan of using wireless anything that is touching the body for extended periods of time. So the first level of mitigation when it comes to EMFs is really anything touching the body. Think about it twice. If you have a heart rate monitor and you use it for workouts and it's a few hours per week, that's something. If you have a phone in the pocket 8 to 12 hours per day, that's another thing, right? So it's really the dose that makes the problem here, that makes the poison. But when it comes to other types of exposure, also look at what is in the vicinity of where you sleep or where you work. So that's where we get into, okay, well, what is next on my nightstand? Is there anything that could be wireless? Turn it off, unplug it, make sure that in the bedroom there's no wireless. And it means that your phone could be on airplane mode if you still want to use functions such as the alarm clock, which I do every night, or you can completely turn it off. And for some parents that they don't have a corded landline anymore, they're rolling these out in the US and most of the Western world these days. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to be able to be called in the middle of the night if there's an emergency. So put your phone in just the next room. That's fine. Maximum ringer. If there's anyone, charge it in another room. That's a better situation than just having it right next to you anyway. So it's really looking at the different sources in the bedroom that will help you. As far as Wi-Fi goes, I just posted a podcast recently, how to live without Wi-Fi, as if that's something radical to say. It is radical these days. Some people ask me like, "Hey Nick, what's your Wi-Fi password?" when they enter my home as guests, and I say, "Well, we don't have Wi-Fi. Haven't had Wi-Fi for 6 years now. My son is 5.5, and we started. I guess that's 6 years and a half ago, 1 year prior to him being born. Like right as we were trying to conceive, we decided, okay, let's turn off Wi-Fi. How do we do it? Well, we have cables. An Ethernet cable still exists to this day. Yes, believe it or not. And you can have a company that will pass these cables in the walls and have it one at your workstation, one in for your video game console, one next to your bedstand if you want. And it turns out you can use these cables on an iPhone, on a tablet, on a laptop, on your desktop computer. It just requires different conversion between an Ethernet cable and then the native port of your machine. Like an iPhone would require an Ethernet to Lightning converter, but it costs $10. So I show on my YouTube channel and podcast. That's the type of stuff that I show people how to do, because we need to relearn how to use these technologies in a way that at least slightly safer or much safer if you use it wired. So my computer is wired right now. My phone is wired most of the time. If I go on Instagram in the morning, it is wired at the kitchen table. Sometimes I will open my phone if I go about in the city, but I don't do it for very extended periods of time. And when I put my phone back in my back pocket, it is on airplane mode. So I'm mitigating most of the risks. So it's really all of these things can be automated. And I know that a lot of people listening to this will not cut out Wi-Fi. It's a fight to have with your family, or let's say a discussion, let's put it this way, a really nice discussion to have maybe with your spouse. But it's a hard sell these days. So start by turning it off at night. That's what I recommend, generally speaking, is setting it on those countdown timers, like a Christmas light timer type of outlet, where you can set it and forget it. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and you can have relief during the night. And just this step alone, some people reported back to me and said, Nick, I think I sleep better. I have a better sleep quality just out of turning off my own Wi-Fi router. And what is bizarre to me is that even if you don't turn off the 200 other routers in your neighborhood, just the one in your home, some people see better sleep. So it means that probably the one that is closest to your body has the most dramatic effect. I can only imagine what would happen if we lose all electricity for 1 or 2 days. Maybe everyone would sleep very, very good. I don't wish that on anyone, but it would be a cool experiment regardless. But isn't that crazy? But some people do realize it. They go camping,
Yeah.
and a lot of people see, my God, I slept like a rock. I was dead last night.
This
Well,
this is very
yeah.
funny. There are retreats for like high performer CEO types in say Los Angeles or San Francisco area, where they go to these adult camps, and the first thing that they do when they go to these adult camps is they take away all their wireless devices.
Yeah.
So you're paying in some cases very large sums of money to go to these places, to have somebody take away your phone when you could easily be doing some things to reduce your exposure yourself on a daily basis. Maybe you wouldn't get to the point where you need somebody else to take it away from you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
100%.
very, very interesting. So let me just recap a little bit there so that I can make sense of it for myself, and maybe it'll help some of the people who are watching. So step number one is things that are touching your body. And if it's a cell phone, make sure that it's on airplane mode. Simple. If it's
Yes.
earbuds, try and make sure that they're wired and not a Bluetooth style device, because as you said, proximity is a big deal. And the closer it gets into your brain, meaning here, outside of your ear versus inside of your ear, we're talking we're this much closer to the
Yeah.
brain. And even though it's a smaller device, if like some of the kids where I live, they've got their buds in all day long. So
Yeah.
now you're talking about that summation effect. The other
Exactly.
thing that you're talking about is potentially using wired internet in your home, or at the very least, unplugging your Wi-Fi when you're sleeping at night. So simple things that we shouldn't be arguing with. Other things that people can be doing that you mentioned are unplugging devices in their room around their bed, so you're not getting that exposure during that 7 to 8 hours every single night. I want you to just expand upon one thing, which is the the third plug, the grounding cable. So if something only has two plugs and doesn't have the grounding cable, it's putting out a much larger signal than something that has the grounding cable.
It's emitting a larger field of electricity, those low level or ELF electric fields. So it's really what it's doing is that there's more, it can be measured in the form of body voltage. You can literally measure the voltage running through your body. And sometimes it's the equivalent of, a 1.5 volt battery or a 3 volt battery. It's not enough for you to perceive it, but it looks like your biology does perceive it, because some people feel that like they sleep way better at night if they reduce these to levels where building biologists would find it, optimal. So again, the goal is to have as much electricity coursing through your body as you would have in nature, which is zero. You wouldn't have any electricity coursing through your body if you're in a forest, right? It wouldn't be, you would just have the natural frequencies from the stars, from the sun, from the earth. You have, and all of these frequencies keep our body's circadian rhythm in tune. But these frequencies that are external, such as the electrical field, are disrupting these natural cycles. So if most lamps, unfortunately, are just two prongs, so I recommend, generally speaking, to unplug the lamps instead of turning them off. And there's a difference, because the electricity goes up the wire and into the lamp. Even if you turn off the lamp, you still have electricity in this machine. If you unplug it, you do not. So you're extending the electrical field, and there's going to be a little bit more electricity running through your body. So even in hotel rooms, I'm known to kind of disrupt the entire room, unplug everything, take the wireless phones, and sometimes I put them away in another room if they're wireless and they keep their battery powered, and all sorts of shenanigans. I even found a router under my bed when I was in Austin, Texas, in a very high-end hotel, under the bed. It literally the pillows, and you had the router about here, 2 feet underneath the pillow. So I had to move the furniture to show it on camera, and I moved everything back, or else they're gonna charge me like extra for the chaos I've created. But it was just to show a point, even in high-end hotels, they are so focused on having the best pillows, the best mattresses, and the comfort, and a little, chocolate on your pillow. But they don't get that if you place a router under the bed, that's a very poor placement. They could have placed it in the closet, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
somewhere else, even just creating distance.
Sure.
And that's just because designers that are designing these rooms, or even might be the IT department, like where would it be convenient to place those? Oh, well, there's a plug there. We're going to hide it under the bed, and that way people don't see it. It's ugly, right? So it's not part of our culture yet. And I hope that eventually we will see more brands, more hotels, and more even electronics company, which I'm seeing that are cognizant of these problems with wireless and are trying to come up with better solutions. and it's starting, but it's going to take a few decades until I think we can have technology that really, really is compatible with our well-being.
Well said. There's one other element of this that we're not going to have time to get into, but there are significant differences from one individual to the next on how the same EMFs can affect them. And there's even an emerging phrase or diagnosis that I read several times that was electromagnetic hypersensitivity syndrome, or there's several terms that they were using for this. And there was something else about differences in the way that it affects one person to another, talking about hydration levels and the amount of electrolytes that a person has in their body, body mass index, body size, bone density, all of these things, just determining essentially the amount of conductors for these EMFs that a person has in their body. So I think it's important to acknowledge that if a person is feeling a certain way in response to these things, and a person standing next to them is not feeling that way, it doesn't automatically wipe out what that first person's experience is. And I know that you have a summit coming up where you're going to talk about some of those differences. When is that happening?
It's happening from April 11th to 14th. It's called the EMF Hazard Summit, and it's the third annual summit we've been doing, but this time it's focused on electrosensitivity. And another term for it, some people talk about electromagnetic radiation poisoning. There are differences by default by people who seem to very easily be symptomatic from these fields. But it's important to note that let's say, what the research is showing is that, you could have a phone in your pocket and your sperm is affected, so therefore your entire health and hormonal production, for example, but you don't initially feel it. You don't initially will pinpoint a symptom related to that. But for some other people, it is literally a symptom where they talk on the phone, they have a headache. They don't talk on the phone, they don't. So for them, it's very clear. It doesn't mean that people who are not feeling it are not affected, but the reality is now we're talking about an epidemic of certain EMF aware doctors that are seeing these patients come in and they say, I don't feel well in a city now. I have a hard time at my job. I get brain fog. I get memory lapses. So it looks like for some people, it's the cumulative effect and it's becoming too much. And some researchers have been trying to pinpoint what is the percentage of people that are feeling it. And according to Dr. Magda Havas, who's an environmental toxicity scientist from Canada, she said that up to a third of all adults already experience mild to moderate symptoms related to this electrosensitivity. So my invitation with this summit is really to learn from the best researchers and doctors, attorneys about this topic and discover for themselves, is it affecting their everyday health more than they think? And for a lot of people, the answer is yes. And then, of course, an invitation to lower these exposures to feel better.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you want to find out even more about EMFs, I strongly recommend checking out the EMF Guy's books. I'll put links for those in the description down below. And also, Nicolas has an upcoming online event where he's bringing in a bunch of experts to talk all about electromagnetic hypersensitivity. To sign up for that, you can click the link in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Beyond that, I just want to thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.